Got an interesting guest with an interesting book for you guys. You might recognize him. It's Brian Stelter. He's the chief media correspondent for CNN, and obviously does Reliable Sources, a show I've been on a couple of times. His new book is Hoax, the untold story of Trump and Fox News. It's now a New York Times bestseller. Brian, welcome to TYT.
This is my first time here. Thank you. I'm honored to be here.
No, great to have you. So let me start with a funny question. When did it first occur to you? Like, there's some chance Fox News might not be on the level.
Right. It's not actually fair and balanced anymore. Yeah. Look, I mean, obviously in 1996 when the channel launched, that slogan was cynical back then, and it's much more cynical now. The channel's always been conservative. It's always bent to the right. What sources at Fox said to me was that in the Trump years, it's fallen over. It's not right-leaning, it's fallen over. The channel's gone off the rails. There were so many sources coming to me saying, Brian, something's wrong at our channel, that I feel like I had to write this book now because the channel's become an arm of the Trump administration. And as much as the channel was conservative in the Bush years, as much as it was anti-Obama in the Obama years, it's even worse now.
Yeah. How many sources did you have inside Fox?
Well, originally I was talking to people in my normal course of work covering the news at CNN. And as I started to think about doing a book, I called more and more people to the point where I talked to about 140 people inside Fox and about more than 180 outside Fox. This means former staffers, agents, managers. There's a lot of people that are in and around Fox world, because this is a massive global corporation. So what really surprised me was how many people wanted to talk to me. There are so many folks inside Fox who are worried about the direction of the network.
So well, that's the interesting thing, right? Because in cable news, Fox is kind of a fascinating creature. I think for folks outside of cable news, Fox has always been fairly clear. I remember when me and my dad were Republicans, and my dad called me one day and said, Cenk, I think Bill O'Reilly full of crap. I said, really? Because we're both Republicans at that point. I was curious about it. He's like, yeah, I don't think he's telling the truth. But when I was at MSNBC, Brian, a lot of folks there used to work at Fox News, and so was that part of the reticence, you think, to call out Fox News because they've been doing this for quite some time?
Well, I think Fox has always been viewed as one of these major networks with lots in common with CNN and MSNBC, even though it's conservative. For example, Fox is in the White House press pool, right? Fox has its turn in the press pool. Fox has all those sorts of roles that make it one of the big institutional players in American media. That's been true for 20 years. I think what's different in the Trump years is the channel's most popular shows are propaganda. Sean Hannity is propaganda, Tucker's propaganda. In a way they never were, even in the Obama years, because now they are working with the Trump administration. Now they are working with the president. And that has caused a lot of consternation. For example, folks at NBC, or you mentioned you used to work at MSNBC. I had executives at NBC say to me, we get a lot of resumes from people at Fox, but we don't hire many of them anymore because it's a different kind of business. We view that as a lifestyle brand. What an interesting way to view Fox News, right? A lifestyle brand.
Yeah. Well, look, there's the other phenomenon too of there's the people who used to work at Fox News, but then your predecessor Howard Kurtz at it was Reliable Sources. Then he got a job at Fox News, probably a lucrative one, and that was a factor. But now, if folks are not hiring out of Fox News, that's a sea change, and I think it can make a big.
Well, I think what
difference.
we're seeing is the opposite. We're seeing the opposite now. We're seeing people leave Fox and looking for jobs elsewhere. So about a dozen people that I describe in Hoax who left the network because they couldn't take all the Trump propaganda anymore. Now, some of these names we know, like Shepard Smith, who joined CNBC. Others are anonymous. Others are producers who will never be household names, but they felt like they didn't really fit in at Fox anymore. I think what's happened is the incentive structure at Fox is all wrong now. It's all about serving the dear leader. And that is damaging in the short term and in the long term, to both Fox and Trump.
So let's break down the word propaganda, because I think that's really interesting, and I think it's got layers. So and I might have a slightly different point of view than you do on this, because I think the issue is their outrageous lies, as opposed to them brazenly supporting Donald Trump. So if Sean Hannity says, look, I'm a talk show host and I'm a pundit and a commentator, and yeah, I talk to President Trump from time to time, and yes, I give him advice, and we agree, and this is my point of view, I actually don't have any problem with that, as long as he doesn't twist the facts. Do you think that's a problem in and of itself?
I think we're moving toward a world of more and more point of view media. And there's going to be lots more of it on the left and lots more on the right. And it's not necessarily bad at all. I think it's probably part of a diverse political world. And I think a lot of people prefer it this way. I think the problem with Hannity is when he says one thing off the air and another thing on the air.
Yep.
When he's talking to Hannity, when he was talking to Trump, sorry, I mixed them up a lot because they're basically the same now. When Hannity's talking to Trump on the phone, but then not sharing the conversations on the air, that's a problem. When Hannity is telling his friends that Trump is crazy, but then praising Trump on the air, that is a problem. And so I think it's the hypocrisy that is the fundamental problem at Fox. I would also add this. On Fox, Trump gets the benefit of the doubt. They pretend like his words are always truthful. They assume he's always telling the truth. And that is a fundamentally broken concept. Maybe that would have worked for past presidents, maybe, although there's a long history of presidential mendacity, but it doesn't work with Trump. And it's the fact that they give him the benefit of the doubt and pretend like he's always being the honest, truthful leader. It shows how broken Fox is.
Yeah, so I agree with that 100%. If Hannity thinks that Trump is crazy and he tells his audience that Trump is awesome, well, that's pretty much definition of propaganda. And so, but let's dive a little further in. So folks will say, yeah, but and I would come close to saying this at MSNBC, if they go outside of a Democratic talking point, it is news, and it'll go online like, wow, Rachel Maddow said something that Democrats don't necessarily agree with. So where do we put that on the spectrum?
Well, I think one of the big differences I see between MSNBC and Fox in the Trump age is that MSNBC is pro-journalism and Fox is anti-journalism. And what I mean by that is Sean Hannity says journalism is dead, and he says it's all fake news. And basically what Hannity's doing is he's saying, only trust me, don't go anywhere else. It's a way of closing off the conversation. Whereas someone like Rachel Maddow or the other host on MSNBC, they will interview New York Times reporters and Washington Post reporters, and they will say, go subscribe to your local paper. I think what MSNBC wants is a more healthy ecosystem. I think what Fox wants is a closed ecosystem where you only watch Fox. And that is a big problem. Now, look, Cenk, I think there should probably be an entire book about MSNBC. There's a lot of issues at MSNBC, and I think I would read that book in a heartbeat. I think Fox is special though because of its link to the Trump administration. And frankly, I think Fox is in charge a lot of the time. Fox is setting the agenda for the president. And we've never seen that before. Like, did you ever see that with MSNBC and Obama, where it was like MSNBC was telling Obama what to do?
No, but it did work the other way. So they, when I was a host there, they literally dissuaded me from criticizing the president. They did it in subtle ways, they did it in non-subtle ways. But well, there's the famous, not famous, but famous to me, but to our audience maybe, but the speech that Phil Griffin gave me about, Washington's not happy about your tone. But I think the more interesting example is when I was on air and it was covering Obama's live press conference about the Egyptian revolution. So that dates me. And I said, well, I'm going to keep it real about what President Obama had just said, because he had supported Mubarak and the revolution. And my producer was in my ear immediately saying, don't do it. And then there was a whole conversation about when is it kosher to criticize the president. So
wow,
yeah,
well,
no, that definitely happens
right here and now on the Young Turks. If that ever happens to me and someone's in my ear at CNN saying that, I'll tell the viewers. Because in the same way that you've told it, the same way that you've shared it, because that's a big problem. I remember the first week of the Trump administration being at CNN, and someone from the White House called to complain about me, and I was told about the call just as a courtesy, but it was more in just what a crazy world sort of way. You know what I mean? Like, it's good to know when people complain, but it should never affect our coverage.
Yeah, and so Brian, let's talk about CNN just a little bit. And look, your book is going to be well received by our audience. And the fact that you've got all those sources inside of Fox News makes it even more interesting. So it's not. I don't know if it's controversial in other places, but for the TYT audience, right, writing a book about Fox News called "Hoax" is not controversial, but in a good way. It's it's illustrative. It's important that it's documented and on the record. So
let's do it. But
no. That it's so I find it uncontroversial. So
sure,
real quick on CNN, it's. I think that it's fair to say that does CNN have a centrist bias? And so I wanted to ask you about that. So, hey, look, if we're saying, hey, we're not with the right wing and we're not with the left wing, well, it still is a perspective. And in fact, it almost privileges that perspective as the objective one when folks, including myself, would say that's not necessarily correct.
Right, that's the safe place to be. Look, I think it's important to have people like you calling out this issue. I really mean that. I think that criticism, constructive criticism, makes CNN better. When Sean Hannity is on the air calling me Humpty Dumpty, that's just stupid juvenile nonsense, But when people point out how political stories are framed and how narratives are framed, that is important because that's a gut check for reporters to make sure they're being fair and make sure they're not viewing it the way they always have. Here's where I'm hopeful. I think that the Trump years have caused a lot of journalists, especially at CNN, to have a more adversarial, aggressive approach toward the government. And that doesn't just mean the Trump administration, that means the government, right? What we've seen in the past 4 years is how many lies and how much nonsense comes out of these government agencies, not just from Trump, but from other agencies. And what I hope and what I believe is that more adversarial approach is gonna long live past the Trump years. And if it doesn't, then you need to call us out on that because an adversarial approach is the right approach for the national news media.
Yeah, from your mouth to God's ears, or maybe CNN executive
right?
ears,
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Because look, Brian, I'm obviously very direct with the audience, and I want Trump to lose with the heat of 1,000 suns. But if Biden wins, it's super important for the media not to go back to sleep. They need to continue to be adversarial and challenge the government to make sure that he's also telling the truth and doing the things that he said he would do. So I hope that stays in that case. And I hope that it has these Trump years in a silver lining of it might be the more adversarial nature of media, because I think it's supposed to be that way. But your book's an important part of that. It's called Hoax. Everybody check it out. Brian Stelter, host of Reliable Sources. Thank you so much for joining us, Brian. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Hope to be back on the conversation someday. Thanks.
On the go? Don't worry, we got you covered. You can still listen to TYT at our new podcast network. Find us on Apple Podcasts, the Google Play Store, or at tyt.com/podcast.